Hello and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr Ron Ehrlich. Animals are an important part of our lives. They always have been. Whether we're talking about going back in time to the beginning of our human journey and our relationships with animals as a food source, or more recently in human history as a domesticated animal and companion, we've got lots to learn about them and from them, and in many ways, their health is a reflection of our own health. As a general rule, I think we could say that what is good for an animal's health is generally good for our health and most likely the health of the planet. My guest today is Dr Ian Billinghurst. He's a nutritionist, an agricultural scientist, a veterinary surgeon, an author, a lecturer, a nutritional consultant, and a fascinating guy. In fact, his latest book is called Pointing the Bone at Cancer. There are so many interesting parallels here between our own health journey and those of our domesticated animals. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Dr. Ian Billinghurst. Welcome to the show, Ian.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Ian, you've written this book, Pointing the Bone at Cancer, and it's something we really want to talk about today, obviously, but I wondered if you might share a bit of your own journey, professionally, personally, that got you to this point.
Well, yes, it's a long story. At 74 years of age, it hasn't been a rapid journey. I started off at an agricultural high school, then I did agricultural science at uni, where I learned a lot about nutrition of farm animals and agronomy, and they were my major subjects. And then I went and became, ironically, an agronomist at Orange Agricultural Research Station, where we were looking at potatoes, which I now regard just as almost pure sugar when you feed them. But I didn't feel particularly satisfied in that role, so I entered the education sphere and went teaching for approximately 4 years, during which time I did a dip ed. And in that period, in the dip ed, one of the most important books I read was by Karl Popper, and it was The Philosophy of Science, and that was intriguing. That stayed with me for a long time, and I won't go into that now because it's a lot of in-depth stuff. But I was yearning to be something, either a doctor or a veterinary surgeon. I just wanted, and the reason I wanted to do that was because, ironically, again, I was out as a young man in my early 20s, newly married actually, and we were shooting rabbits, and I rather enjoyed cutting them open after they'd been shot and pulling their intestines out and dressing them and feeding them to the dogs and to the family and all that sort of thing. Now I can't do it, of course. I can't shoot anything. So a long story short again, I entered veterinary science and became a veterinary surgeon. And during that course, we were taught nutrition for companion animals. And I thought, this is going to be fantastic. But it wasn't, because the bottom line was, and I was actually taught this by an agricultural science graduate, would you believe, in the veterinary course, that the bottom line to feeding companion animals was to be able to read. And if you had a packet and it said this was a complete and balanced diet, or a tin or whatever the supposed food was in, this was all you had to know. That was the bottom line. So this was highly unsatisfactory. And when I got out as a newly graduated veterinary surgeon, I found that was one of the commonest things people asked me, particularly if they had a puppy or a young kitten: how do we feed? What do we feed? And I was rather in a state of, perplexity. So I gave them some disjointed account of, we were taught to say processed pet food, but my experience is, and I would tell them what I used to do and what I still did. In any case, our family went into taking dogs to shows, and I was told by those who must be obeyed within the family, we're going to start feeding our dogs the proper way with processed food, because that's the correct way to feed them. Well, over the next 2 years, I watched my own animals deteriorate, and it was dreadful. And I had to start treating my own animals for the first time for all sorts of things: ear problems, skin problems, allergies. We were breeding dogs. We had growth problems. And at the time, I was studying acupuncture. And I was meeting a whole heap of people, and they reintroduced me to the idea that, hey, what I'd been doing long ago was far more correct, much closer to the truth. So I started looking at feeding dogs just what was available in the way of raw food that I knew about, raw meaty bones, chicken necks and wings, household scraps, and lo and behold, my own animals became healthy again. Well, this ended up with a book called Give Your Dog a Bone, from which I was invited to speak in England, and then we did that, and from there the internet was just beginning, and the whole thing was going mad, and somebody had looked at the people on the internet who had read my book and were now feeding raw, and she likened them to evangelizing Christians. So they were called born-again raw feeders. And this was conveyed to me, and I looked at what was going on the internet, and it was quite frightening because some people were quite vitriolic in their enthusiasm, and there was the opposition and so on. Anyway, I looked at this acronym. And then this lady herself, who was watching these people feed this way, she said, "Oh, I might give it a go," and she did, and it worked for her. So she now said, "Oh, well, it's bones and raw food, not born-again raw feeders." This was the acronym BARF. And I looked at this when it was conveyed to me, and I said, let's go more scientific, biologically appropriate raw food. Well, from there, yes, I was invited to England, then the States. We did 3 months in the States, touring every major city across the States. And so the thing has grown from there. And from that time on, I've written several other books, Grow Your Pups with Bones for breeders, the BARF diet, and then a huge gap to this latest book, Pointing the Bone at Cancer. So my whole journey has been a personal one of growth in the area of nutrition. And I realized very early on, as I watched animals transform in the practice that I had, small companion animal practice, if I could persuade the owners to drop the processed food and begin to feed real whole raw food based on mostly on raw meaty bones and offal and healthy food scraps, those dogs and cats transformed. And so my whole journey from that point, apart from being a conventional veterinary surgeon, has been to learn about nutrition. And that's where I am today.
Wow, what a journey. And a couple of things kind of jump out at me there, that the influence on you as a student and as a young professional, not just a young professional, you could have kept on going, was through this ag science, learn to read a label, processed food is the way of the future. And then you look at our food pyramid for us as humans and the influence that the USDA, whose job it is to sell agricultural products primarily, the influence that that's had on human nutrition. So this parallel path of processed food and its impact is an interesting one.
Oh, yes. And today, so the latest book I've written is for both humans and animals. But early on, when I spoke to clients, there was always a hidden agenda in my work, because they would say to me, "But does this apply to us as well?" And I said, "Yes, of course it does." And so people would change their own lifestyle and their own habits based on what they were seeing in their dogs and cats as a result of changing their diet. And the problem we have is that young students today, veterinary students, are totally captured by the ethos of the USDA and AFCO, American Association of Feed Control Officials, where we are feeding companion animals the most atrocious food, but it's based on feed standards for livestock, but not anything other, not to make them healthy, but simply to grow them as quickly as possible for an early death. And we are now feeding food which to our companion animals based on that ethos, and we do grow them rapidly with high carbohydrate diets and all that sort of thing. And anything that's grown rapidly does have an early death. And we know so much more now. Back then, I said to myself, well, I'm going to find out why it is that this food is so dreadful in terms of degenerative disease, in terms of things like arthritis, autoimmune disease, kidney failure, and so on and so forth, and not to mention cancer, why it is. And of course, over that length of time, and particularly in the last 10 years, and most particularly in the last 5 years, the amount of information we're getting is absolutely enormous. And we now know that most degenerative diseases are based on energy production, and that comes back to mitochondria, and most of them are actually based on mitochondrial malfunction. But that's the whole, and that's what pointing the bone is very much about.
Yes, well, we're going to get into that, which was my next question, and that was pointing the bone at cancer. Explain the title.
Well, I've spoken to young Australians, and not a lot of them know this. Old Australians all seem to know it. In our Australian Aboriginal population, in times gone by, any miscreant or maldoer who had done really bad things, instead of being punished physically, was punished mentally by pointing this bone that the miscreant, the wrongdoer, believed had such power that it would kill them. And so when the bone was pointed by the Kadacha man or witch doctor or whatever you want to call this person within the community, that person then gave up. Basically, there was a cognitive situation or process was set in train, and that person just quietly faded away. So in pointing the bone at cancer, the bone becomes a symbol for evolutionary nutrition or sound nutrition or genomic nutrition in general, what I eventually call in the book targeted nutritional therapy. And the whole thing is that when we start using nutrition as a tool to defeat cancer, and in fact most other diseases of degeneration, if it's done properly, in other words, it's genome-based, the problem quietly disappears, rather like the death of the individual at whom the bone was pointed in Australian Aboriginal long-term folklore or long-term cultural practices. So that's what the book title alludes to.
Well, now in the book, you talk about our current understanding of cancer is incorrect, and this is a theme that we've been pursuing in this podcast over the last couple of weeks anyway, and we'll continue to do. Can you explain that? What's the current state of understanding, and where have we gone wrong?
Okay, the current state of understanding is it's kind of half-truths. We know that carcinogens, and the carcinogens can be chemicals, radiation, and infective organisms like bacteria and viruses, more particularly viruses, but also some bacteria, and also lifestyle can all act in a way that impacts, this is the current belief, as carcinogens, they impact the genome of the nucleus. This is the current belief. And they cause mutations directly to the genome. And the genome then, and these mutations are to growth-controlling genes. So and in broad terms, there are growth accelerators and there are growth inhibitors. And they call the growth accelerators oncogenes. And the growth inhibitors, well, they're just genes that put a brake on cell growth. And there are two very important ones. One's called P53, the other's retinoblastoma. But so the belief is that if we can target, and this brings us to the smart drugs, just forget about the dreadful things we do to our patients with chemotherapy and radiation and mutilating with surgery in many instances. Forget about that for the moment, but we've now got these things called smart drugs. And these smart drugs either target the gene that has been mutated, and there are mutated genes, and they are driving the cancer, but we'll come back to where that is. They target either that gene or the protein product of that gene. And so these smart drugs, these are thought to be the future of cancer. But the problem is, if you look at a cancer cell, each cell has a different number of mutated genes, and throughout that, and every different cancer, even if it's, say, a pancreatic cancer in different individuals, has a different cohort of mutated growth accelerating and growth. Hello, we lost you?
No, I'm still here. I'm mesmerised.
No, I can hear. Oh, okay. So we've got this cohort of genes that are different for every individual cancer, and so we have an impossibly large number of genes and their protein products to attack. And not only that, these are not the initiating causes of cancer. what we now know is that cancer originates, and this is exciting stuff, because on the basis of true knowledge of what actually causes cancer, we have an opportunity to defeat it. And we know now that we are not defeating cancer. And we can go through the statistics. Sure, we win a few small skirmishes and people appear to get better, but mostly it relapses and comes back, or they live a terrible life based on the problems that the treatment has caused. But we are not winning this war against cancer. So what is the truth? Well, the truth was actually discovered by a fellow, Professor Otto Warburg, and he was a Nobel laureate scientist. He was a German, and he discovered way back 1920s, 1930s, and by the way, he discovered, or his team discovered, much of the basic biochemistry we now understand today. But he found out that the whole problem is an energy problem, and what happens is that we have in every tissue in our body we have stem cells, and they are the cells that reproduce and provide the new cells for the tissues as cells wear out. But if those stem cells are attacked by carcinogens, there is a very vulnerable genome within those stem cells, and that is the genome of the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria actually originate from bacteria, and they're circular, and there are lots of them in each mitochondria. And in very active cells, there's lots of mitochondria, and like the liver or the muscles. But if you have a very acute attack on those mitochondria by carcinogens, the cell simply dies. But what Warburg discovered was this: if the mitochondria are attacked slowly over a long period of time, which is the way most carcinogens work, as they turn off the energy supply produced by the mitochondria, which is a very efficient energy supply, it burns fat and it burns sugar, basically, also protein by way of sugar. But if you turn that off very slowly, the cell does not die. It adapts. It turns on this saving fermentation form of producing energy. Now, this is a form that all cells have, but in most cells, it's so inefficient, it can't support the cell. But if the cell now starts to produce by fermentation, and it ferments sugar and also sometimes an amino acid called glutamine, but mostly sugar, if it manages to produce a similar level of energy that was produced formerly by this more efficient method by the mitochondria, which are now pretty well not working very well, or not at all, this turns on a genetic program. Now, just to illustrate how important this is, if we look at an early embryonic stem cell, it also produces its energy by fermentation. And we know that when a cell is producing energy by this fermentation method, it's sending signals to the nucleus that this is the time to go into reproductive mode. And to just turn on every source of reproduction possible. And as it happens in this particular program, also in the cancer cells, turns off two very important growth suppressor genes. That's the P53 and the retinoblastoma. And when that happens, what's happening now is that mutations start to accumulate. And this is the origin of the mutations. But the problem begins in the mitochondria, not in the genome. And the carcinogens attack. Why do they attack the genome of the mitochondria? Because it's bacterial in origin. It's actually this was a long ago parasite, and it's not well protected. It's out there, and so this genome is being attacked by the carcinogens. This is turning off the very efficient. And just to let people know, it's called oxidative phosphorylation, way of producing energy by the mitochondria. We have this resurrection in this tissue stem cell of this, it's called glycolysis, but it's a fermentation process. That's the signal to the nucleus to begin the process of reproduction. This is the beginning of cancer. And because those retinoblastoma and P53 are actually bypassed or turned off, we now get an accumulation of mutations to those growth controlling genes, because these are the ones that are now exposed, and these are the ones that are being used. And every time they're being used to reproduce, and every time they're used to reproduce, they're open to, changes. But because the retinoblastoma, the P53 is turned off, there is no repair of mutations. And now the mutations drive it. This is what we're currently looking at. We're looking at the mutations and the protein products of those mutations and attempting to defeat cancer that way. But there's a much simpler, more logical, more humane, more beneficial way, and that is to attack the cell, the cancerous cell, through nutrition. And those cancer cells, because they don't have mitochondria and only ferment, can only use sugar. So if we limit the sugar and give the body a food that the cancer can't use, we can effectively starve the cancer. And of course, that food is ketones. So
yeah, we're going to get onto
fasting. Yeah,
we're going to get onto that. But that philosophical difference, that interposing of that one step, well, it's not one, but one idea that it's an energy problem, not a mutation of the cancer cell problem, has huge implications for how we approach it. Because, of course, you mentioned chemotherapy, you mentioned radiation, and of course, that's kind of like throwing a hand grenade into the thing. It just kind of explodes and kills there's a lot of collateral damage, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. We're destroying the immunity. We're destroying not only the cells involved, but other cells throughout the body. We're weakening the patient. And it's not surprising. And we're using things that are actually also carcinogenic, both chemotherapy and radiotherapy. So we're using things that cause cancer to attempt to treat cancer. And it's a futile way of doing things. And unfortunately, even the smart drugs are not working.
Yeah, and fundamentally, the beauty, and this is what I know you find it very exciting, I do too, and the beauty of this is that what we're doing is taking a step back and saying, hey, there's a difference between the way a human healthy cell produces energy, and there's a difference between the way a cancer cell produces energy. Let's target that.
Absolutely, and that's what we need to target, because even if you forget about the background to all of this, which is absolutely fascinating and totally validates this approach, even if you just understand very simply that the cancer cell cannot produce energy in the way a normal cell does, and therefore this is its Achilles heel, that's all you need to know.
Yeah. Yes, well...
that invalidates a lot of research that we're doing, by the way. It doesn't really invalidate it. It's wonderful research, and it's produced thousands of papers, well, probably hundreds of thousands of papers. It's produced biotech companies, and it's produced lots of research scientists, but it hasn't done a great deal, if anything, for the cancer patient.
Yeah, which begs the question. I mean, this is not new information, although a lot of new information has built more structure to the theory, but it's not happening out there. I mean, acceptance of new ideas doesn't happen very quickly, does it?
No, it doesn't. In this case, there is an enormous impediment. It's called money, and we have a pharmaceutical industry that absolutely thrives and is continuing to thrive and to grow on a lovely and steady supply of cancer patients. And we're certainly getting that. The cancer problem is growing, and our inability to treat it is equal to the task. It's continuing to be unable to treat it, and this in fact continues to drive the cancer industry. And the really sad thing is that the bulk of our physicians, whether they be and oncologists, whether they be veterinary or medical, are trained by these pharmaceutical companies. We have the same thing with vets who are trained in nutrition by the pet food companies, but our oncologists are trained by the very companies that are going to profit from the sale and use of their products. Yeah,
this is like history repeating itself. There you were as a student being taught by the agri-scientist who worked for the processed food industry, teaching you, in inverted commas, nutrition. And here the oncologists are being encouraged to get themselves involved in research grants and everything to find the greatest breakthrough drug in oncology, to find that magic bullet.
That's exactly right. And You can't make money out of nutrition, so they're not interested.
Well, let's talk about that. Well, not about the making money, but let's talk about the nutrition, because this kind of approach does give great hope, empowers individuals to take control a little bit more of, well, not a little bit, a lot more. Let's talk about let's talk about firstly the role that the Western diet, sugar, has had on this incidence of cancer.
Yes, well, that's a whole subject in itself, but it boils down, I think, mostly to two words: sugar and insulin. And if we look at high sugar, what does it do? Well, it promotes inflammation. That's a known fact. Secondly, it promotes a process called glycation, which is a non-enzymatic, so non-biological combining of sugar with important molecules in the body, which are proteins and lipids, and also with DNA, the genomic material. So sugar is very destructive just on those terms. But also, sugar encourages us to eat more sugar. So the more sugar we eat, the more sugar that we want to eat. And this in itself has an impact in the mitochondria by driving up the production of what are known as reactive oxygen species, which further damage the mitochondria and other important molecules within the cell. So our love affair with sugar is so dangerous. On the other side of the coin, we have insulin. As our bodies are eating more sugar, the role of insulin, which comes out in response to the high sugar that we put in, is driving the accumulation of fat in our body. And as that happens, our bodies become more resistant to the effects of the insulin. Now, there's a very good evolutionary reason for this. And most people, and indeed I listen to scientists talk about this, they actually got it wrong. Clearly, over evolutionary time, the reason for insulin resistance is so we didn't get too fat. If the body, those fat cells become insulin resistant, they can't absorb as much sugar. But the trouble is then that the sugar, and back in ancient times, this only occurred periodically in particular seasons. So the individual wouldn't get too fat. They were probably also having periods of starvation at odd times. And the insulin resistance just kept their body at a certain level. But today we just eat sugar every day. And back then there were periods when sugar was not abundant, where fat and animals were more abundant, and so on. So and this is where fasting and all that sort of stuff comes in. I'm really shortcutting a few things here. But so sugar encourages obesity, but only to a limited extent. But when we have sugar at every meal 3 times a day, as people do in the Western diet with their cats, dogs, or humans, then we do accumulate it. We get this insulin resistance. Now, with insulin resistance, the level of insulin that is put out by the pancreas rises. And what does insulin do? It promotes inflammation as well, and it also promotes insulin-like growth factor. And so we have a situation, as far as cancer is concerned, that insulin is driving cancer all and of its own. And the sugar is driving cancer by reactive oxygen species, and also because it promotes inflammation. So we have sugar and insulin promoting inflammation, which drives cancer. And I'm horrified as I watch my own profession recommend that dogs eat this way. And of course, if you talk to any nutritionist that's been trained, well, the whole nutrition, and this worries me, the whole nutrition profession actually started off with Kellogg's. And if you talk to a lot of nutritionists today, they will not tell you that sugar is harmful the way it actually is. And this is a real problem. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so that's the story. With sugar, we have to become fat burners, not sugar burners.
Yeah.
And that's the clue.
Yeah, look, it's interesting, Ian, because on this podcast we've done programs on heart disease. I've spoken to Ross Walker, cardiologist, and then we spoke to Dr. Terry Viles, the autoimmune MS person, and talk about cancer, talk about diabetes. it's always coming down to the lower the insulin level, the healthier the individual will be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I mean, this and for you as a vet, because there's much to be learnt from ancestral diets, and I suppose, if I'm not wrong, dogs are carnivores, aren't they?
Well, actually, they're what's called facultative carnivores.
Okay.
When I do my lectures, I put up a slide, and it's called the herbivore carnivore continuum, because a lot of people want to just say, oh, dogs are carnivores. Now, they're getting a little bit mixed up between taxonomic classification and nutritional classification. And on this herbivore carnivore continuum, at the left end, if you're looking at it space on, we have all the herbivores, so cattle and sheep and deer and so on. At the far right, we have obligate carnivores, which are the big cats, or any cat, our little cats. They're obligate carnivores. They have to eat an animal-based diet. It must be at least 70% of the diet for true health. Squarely in the middle, we find genuine omnivores, and things like pigs, humans, and chickens, or chooks, as we say in Australia. Yeah. And to the left of the humans, the pigs, and the chickens, we find animals like rodents, sort of stuck somewhere between humans and the herbivores. And they tend to be a little bit of a grainivore, actually. And the sad thing is we do a lot of our research with those, and we make some wrong assumptions. Some of the assumptions are right, some are wrong. Now, if we go back to the middle again on this continuum with humans, pigs, and chickens roughly in the centre, if we move to the right, we come across the dog. If we move a little bit further to the right, we come across the wolf. And then, of course, extreme right, we come across the cat. And, of course, within a population of, say, wolves or dogs or whatever, there is a small continuum as well. There's the old bell curve where some individuals within a dog population might be a little bit more omnivorous. Other individuals might be a bit more carnivorous. But basically, I call dogs carnivorous omnivores, and wolves are slightly more. And our dogs, of course, together with being carnivorous omnivores, are also scavengers, and that makes a big impact because that's the way they've developed. So, in a sense, yes, they are carnivores. Mm-hmm. They prefer a lot of meat, but they can eat vegetables. And the vegetable material does have benefits. Even the cat gets benefit from vegetable materials because the cat has eaten other animals for probably 30 million years, going back to all its ancestors, has eaten whole animals, including the gut contents. Not always, but quite a bit. So when I prescribe food for a cat, I do include a small amount of vegetable material, and do that simply on the basis that if we feed the evolutionary diet or the genome-appropriate diet for any animal, we have to be feeding it's a complete and balanced diet in a biological sense, not in just the legal sense that we currently do, particularly with our cats and dogs, where food is prescribed for them by these pet food companies.
And how did that stack up? I mean, when you buy your processed food for your dog, I mean, you're saying it's a carnivorous omnivore, but that might suggest that 50% of the natural diet or more, I'm guessing, for dogs would be. I can't imagine dogs out in the wild chomping on too many vegetables and fruits. But I guess if they didn't have a choice, what kind of percentage of protein and carbohydrate are we seeing in processed food for dogs?
Well, and this is a very sad fact, the carbohydrate content is over 50%, or actually the sugar content is over 50%, or around about 50%. And then there is some fibre, and a lot of it's not very valuable fibre because it comes from grains and it's indigestible, and even the bacteria in the large bowel don't attack it readily. It just goes out as large voluminous poos and takes some water with it, helping to dehydrate the dog and some minerals and so on. But yeah, this is not genomic in any sense of the word. Modern pet foods, particularly the dry foods, and they're the most common foods fed to dogs because they're easy. People can store them without any great deal of trouble. They contain Well, they're mostly sugar. It's appalling what they're being fed.
And are you seeing cancer in dogs?
Absolutely. In fact, the dog now is regarded as the most cancer-prone animal on this earth.
Wow.
And the food that we feed is just terrible. There are no protective nutrients. The protein source is dead animals cooked up in a huge vat, and there's fat in this as well, where the delicate fats are destroyed and become toxic. But the protein is cooked and cooked and cooked, and then it's turned into a meal, and that's added to dog foods. It's sold to the pet food companies as a source of proteins. And in itself, it becomes toxic, particularly when that is then recooked, combined with sugary, starchy stuff. This is appalling.
And when we look at animals in the wild, do we see cancer in animals in the wild?
Very rarely. Absolutely not common. Now, you could argue this is because they don't live that long, and they don't in general. But there's no question that the appearance of cancer is very rare in the wild. But it's, as with all degenerative disease, and that includes obesity, which is the mother of many problems, we do not see these problems in the wild.
So let's go back to the ketogenic, because we got a bit distracted there, and we were talking about sugar and insulin and its effects, the glycation, the insulin resistance, the inflammation, the growth factors. Let's talk about the ketogenic diet. What is it? How does it work?
Well, the ketogenic diet, a lot of people are afraid of the ketogenic diet because they're aware of ketoacidosis, which is a pathological condition seen in uncontrolled diabetes, where there's no insulin in the body. But that is a pathological condition, and the only way you could ever get close to it under natural conditions is in extreme starvation, and that's at the point where the person is about to die anyway, or the animal, or whatever. So it's rare. But under normal conditions, as mammalian species, I'll just concentrate on dogs, cats, and humans for a moment, we have spent much of our time, not all of it, but a lot of our time in ketosis. And why is that so? Now, what are ketones? Ketones are small molecules produced by the liver from fat. And we produce mammals, healthy, normal mammals, will produce ketones under conditions of fasting, so 3, 4, 5 days without food. They'll also produce ketones with extreme exercise and perhaps a little bit of fasting thrown in. But also we have a ketogenic diet. And the ketogenic diet will produce ketones. What's a ketogenic diet? It's a diet that's high in fat. It's moderate for protein, not a lot of protein, and as low as possible in carbohydrates. And if you think about how we evolved, we spent a lot of our time not eating because we didn't catch prey or couldn't find food. So we would go into ketosis. And we would at times just hunt animals. And what we did, we preferentially cracked open the skull, ate the brain. We would crack open the bones and eat the marrow. And any fat that was around the intestines, we really went for. And so we would be eating a fat and protein diet. And so this sort of diet would produce ketosis or ketones in our body. Now, what's the value of that? Well, today, because we are not fat, and you become a fat burner, but most of the cells in the body can use the fat for energy, because we can only use fat or sugar, as it turns out. But the fat cannot pass the blood-brain barrier and go into the brain. But that problem is solved by the liver, whose mitochondria take fatty acids and turn them into ketones. And the ketones cross the blood-brain barrier and feed the brain. And so the ketogenic diet is able to replace sugar. And in fact, what we really need to understand is that it's quite normal for humans to be, and cats and dogs, when they're eating a genomically appropriate diet and living a lifestyle that they lived for millions of years of intermittent fasting, for them to be in ketosis. And there's a new term coming up now of being metabolically flexible. Now, we are currently, as cats, dogs and humans, fairly metabolically inflexible because we don't fast and we have a diet that pushes sugar burning rather than fat burning. But we need to think about ketosis as normal and healthy. And in fact, it is more than healthy because we're now looking at ketosis as something that is actually protective and even curative of neurological diseases and other problems.
Yes. Well, this is the therapeutic value of it, but and we'll get onto that in a sec. But the thing I find most interesting is we've become in the last 5, 10, 15 years very focused on ancestral diets, and paleo's become very popular, and I think for good reason. But the one thing, and even when you go back and look at Weston A. Price and you look at traditional diets, but this word of scarcity and prolonged fasting as an integral part of our ancestral experience, to me, is one of the big stories that I think we all need to get our heads around.
Yes, well, I think we've long known as a species, and going back into history, that fasting has therapeutic benefits, but we are now beginning to understand why. And I'll come up with 3 words. One is a word called autophagy, one is detoxification, and the other one is ketosis. Okay. And those 3 things, and I guess some of those things, particularly autophagy, people haven't heard of, but a lot of people haven't.
Go on, Ian. Tell us autophagy. Don't just throw a word in there.
Naughty boy.
Naughty
autophagy. Boy. Okay. Yes. Autophagy is eating self. That's what it means. I think it's Greek, probably Greek origin. Anyway, but autophagy. Now, in phagocytosis, cells eat other things. So that's where the phagocytosis just means eating. But so autophagy or autophagy or autophagocytosis, it kicks in after about 3 days of a fast. And what it does is the body says, okay, I'm now not getting any nutrients in. I'm going to look around the body and look at anything that's either malfunctioning or old and needs to be cleaned out, and I'm going to destroy it. And this could be old cells, it could be organelles within cells, and that could include mitochondria. So, well, mate, you're not working too good. So it puts us into these packets of, or a membrane-bound packet. I've forgotten the name of that. Doesn't matter, autosome or something. But it then combines it with a enzyme-rich component within the cell called a lysosome, and it's completely digested. And so all the amino acids from that are then recycled. So it's taking old stuff and recycling it, and it's producing new stem cells. And so it's a rejuvenating, and it's growing new cells within the body. It's virtually anti-aging. And so we know this is going on now. This is an exciting part of where we are today. This is one of the major benefits of a fast beyond about 3 days, a genuine fast.
So that's autophagy, and detoxification, of course, is part of that process.
It is, and they're now finding that the high-fat diet of ketosis is very much assisting with that detoxification process. It's allowing a lot of that stuff to go out into the bowels and then to be eliminated that way.
And this ketogenic diet, do you think we can be on it indefinitely? I mean, is it a normal state, or how should we approach that? Because it's not easy.
Well, okay. As a preventative for aging, degenerative disease and cancer, so it's a thing we should do intermittently, almost certainly. There is some evidence that people who stay on it, period, don't do as well. And if you think about it in evolutionary terms, the reason is because we're not designed to stay on it full time. But if you have a cancer patient, then you really do have to use that, and that's being used in a place called Keto Pet Sanctuary together with hyperbaric oxygen to great value in pets. And these people are doing some research on pets, principally dogs, because they knew they couldn't get human models for this, to prove the value of ketosis as a therapy and an effective therapy and a humane therapy for cancer. So
we're getting good results with these dog studies?
Oh, absolutely. Brilliant results. And I mean, humans are doing this anecdotally around the world, but and they're getting fantastic results as well. So we need to look at those. But in terms of, do we stay on it forever? We stay on it as long as we need to. And for a cancer patient, I believe this has to be done in a cancer clinic. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because yes, it's happening anecdotally around the world, but it's happening in such large numbers that this is becoming epidemiological. But what we have a profession, we have two professions, the medical and veterinary profession, who only want to accept the science of something. And I could see that people like Thomas Seyfried, Dominic Agostino, those people, they present it either very scientifically or very superficially. I thought we need to get the science out that explains this, so that the layman who has no training in science can understand it. So that was my passion to write Give Your Dog a Bone, to present the science behind all of this. But so that's the reason for writing it. But getting back to your question, we don't stay in it long term, but we do dip in and out of it and follow evolutionary norms. If we're a cancer patient, we need to stay in it longer.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Let me just I can't believe we've been talking for there's so much more to talk about. What are the two, if you had two most important things to pass on to a cancer sufferer, what would they be? I think you've covered them, but let's just put them together in a little bit of a nutshell.
Cut the carbs.
Cut the carbs. Okay. Yeah, cut the carbs. Yep. What does that mean? What does that mean to you in terms of, because people? Because I know that. Yeah. No, hang on. And I think this is one of the things, because a lot of people think low carb is a figure that other people don't. What does low carb mean to you?
It means low sugar. It means low insulin. That's the main thing. The two things, the two dietary interventions that are most important are calorie restriction and reduction in carbs, and basically going into ketosis. And we don't necessarily have to cut the calories by making each meal miserably small, although we can, but we're probably as well to do it by intermittent fasting. So it's an overall cutting the calories. And by doing that, and one example of that is what people who follow the 5-2 diet, where they fast 2 days a week. So, and the other time they just eat, in inverted commas, normally, whatever that means. But they are cutting their overall calorie intake. So, and this is reducing obesity. They're becoming fat burners much of the time, not all the time, but much of the time. And if basically we have to get back to an evolutionary program of nutrition. Forget about Paleolithic, forget about Mediterranean. What are our bodies designed to eat? That's the question. That is the question. And because that's imprinted in our genome. And we now have a new science, or it's probably not that new, I think it was started, we knew about it from the 40s, but it's called epigenetics, where the way our genes respond to diet is enormously plastic. And we can give a bad diet and they'll respond in one way, so a biologically inappropriate diet, or a biologically appropriate diet, and they're going to respond with health. And if we want to live a long time, there is some science that tells us that a calorie-restricted diet is the only proven method of extending life.
Yeah.
Scientifically.
Yeah. Now, listen, I just want to finish with one final question, and this is kind of taking a step back from your role as a vet and also as an author, and we're all consumers and we're all on this journey through life. What do you think the greatest challenge is to people on their health journey through life in our modern world today? What do you think the greatest challenge is?
The greatest challenge is misinformation.
Right. Yeah,
where do you get the right information? I've always felt that people say to me, "Oh, you must hate processed pet food, or you must hate this or that." And I say, "Well, I don't hate anything really. What I hate is untruth. So and truth is power. So what is truth? Well, that becomes a difficult thing. But if we know things, the way things actually work, if we really know how they work, then that's really powerful. And on that basis, we can make a choice. And some people might say, well, okay, I'm going to choose to eat what you call badly because I love to eat badly. And if I have a short life, and if the end is pretty awful, I'll accept that. Now, at the end, they probably don't, but that can be a choice. But it's a choice made on information. And this is what I always try to give people, information on which they can base a valid choice. So our biggest problem is invalid information. And of course, we have an internet now, and it's very difficult to find what is true and what is false. So, and a lot of the science that we look at is simply based on a company trying to push a particular idea because they push down on it and inhibit or won't validate any science that actually shows the truth if it is antagonistic to their products. So you've got to look at vested interest, but oh dear, I'm hoping that what I'm presenting is true, and a lot of the science we're learning now is true because it seems to have the ring of truth and it seems to be doing good, but we just got to keep learning more. But the biggest impediment is lack of knowledge, not knowing the truth.
Gee, Ian, thank you. On that note, a perfect time to thank you for joining me today. It's been fabulous talking to you. We're going to have links to your books and the latest book, Pointing the Bone at Cancer. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Isn't it interesting to hear about the influence of the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, on everyone's health, animals and humans alike? Now, the USDA's primary role is to promote agricultural products, and for the last 40 or 50 years, that's been largely focused on grains, wheat, corn, soy. They had a significant influence on the food pyramid, which has been the foundation in one form or another for almost all that advice for humans and animals alike. And our health problems, avoidable, preventable health problems, seem to suggest that focus, grains and carbs, and the demonisation of fats and cholesterol has not been a particularly good thing. Now, if you've been following the podcast, you'll have realised that irrespective of which disease we are talking about, the lower, and importantly, the lower the insulin, the lower the carbohydrate, the better. And importantly, incorporating healthy fats into your diet and not demonising cholesterol are all an important part of a healthy message. So does that mean that government policies change? Well, if you go onto the USDA site, Dietary Reference Intakes, DRIs, calculator for health professionals. So this is an online tool to help health professionals to, and I quote, calculate daily nutrient recommendations based on the dietary reference intakes established by the Health and Medicine Division of the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. The data represents the most current scientific knowledge on nutrient needs. And we're talking 2018 here. You can go on and read that. Basically, it's the food pyramid. When you add in your weight and your height and your activity levels, and then it spits out a recommendation for you, it's basically the food pyramid with lots of carbs, and keep those fats as low as possible, and by all means avoid cholesterol. So that's the up-to-date supposed government recommendations. Hardly the most scientific or current scientific knowledge on nutrient needs, and that's the USDA's site where you can put your own details in. So give it a go. It's interesting. It's what actually this podcast is about. And I also think we have a lot to learn from history. Ian used terms like evolutionary diet, genomically or genetically appropriate diets. That's that word again, appropriate. and metabolically flexible diets. It was also interesting to hear Ian put animals onto a herbivore, carnivore continuum. And I think this is actually really important. We have, through human history, had a relationship with animals as a source of food. I understand there are ethical issues surrounding factory farmed animals and their health issues that accompany them. That's not just for the animals, but for us and the planet. I'm not a fan of factory farming. I think it's cruel for everybody involved. But we could look at human history and see cultures that have sat on that continuum and sit on that continuum even today, generation after generation. They sit on a different spot on that continuum. The part that worries me a little, and I'd love to get your feedback on this, is veganism. Do you know of a human culture that has survived and thrived for hundreds, or for that matter, thousands of years on a vegan diet? If you do, please drop us a line and let me know. I'll leave that question with you, and perhaps we might explore that in a future podcast. We'll have links to Ian's website where he's got some great resources, some great books and a DVD. So until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak